Welcome everyone. My name's Nadine Liddy. I'm the National Manager for MYAN, the Multicultural Youth Advocacy Network Australia. We're the national peak body representing the rights and interests of young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds. We're really excited to be hosting today's event. What we hope to be really dynamic and informative, hearing from some expert panellists. We're really appreciative of their time and availability and sharing their expertise with us today, but then also hearing from you, and we hope to have some dynamic Q&A in the second half of the session. Just in terms of who we have on the call, we have over 300 RSVPs. We may not have all of those attending, but what I will say is that we have representatives from across sectors, from the settlement, education, training, academic, university sector, government and NGOs from most states and territories. And I'd also like to acknowledge MYAN's partner organisations who are joining us today, MyQ in Queensland, MYAN New South Wales, MyT in Tas, MYAN WA, and MyT in the NT, MYAN ACT, and of course CMY, Centre for Multicultural Youth, who is our auspice org in Victoria. Before we move any further, I'd like to acknowledge the lands across Australia on which we are all meeting today. These are the lands of Australia's First Nations people who represent hundreds of clans and language groups. We recognise their continuing connection to land, sea and community and acknowledge that these lands were never ceded. We respectfully acknowledge Elders past and present and First Nations people who are joining us today. And certainly MYAN works towards reconciliation with and self-determination for the First Nations people of this country. And we certainly recognise that this is an ongoing journey for MYAN and we have much work to do in this space. So today's panel is about putting a spotlight on education from young people, for students from refugee and migrant backgrounds, with some focus on the implications of COVID-19. This health pandemic has had an enormous and unprecedented impact, massive disruptions on education for all of Australia's children and young people, with heightened implications for those who face long-standing access and equity barriers in education, including students from refugee and migrant backgrounds, but not only. We know that education is a critical factor in successful settlement outcomes for young people, and school closures and other disruptions have posed a profound risk of widening educational inequality. While the process of transitioning back to the classroom has been diverse across the country, so for some states, and we'll certainly explore this today, for some states, the closures of schools were only a few weeks and they've been back in the classroom for many months now. For other states like Victoria, who've just come out of a really significant hard lockdown, the school closures have been much more significant and there's been weeks and weeks and weeks, months of that in Victoria, and then Queensland and New South Wales somewhere in between. So while this process of transitioning back to the classroom has varied across the country, we know that many students, their families and teaching staff remain deeply concerned about how this will affect English language and skills acquisition, learning and employment pathways, both in the short, medium and long term. This panel today will explore how these educational challenges are being addressed from a policy, program and service level across Australia, and will be followed by a Q&A with the audience, and I'll run through the agenda or the format in a few minutes. The information from this event, the discussions, will inform the ongoing policy work of a group called the National Education Roundtable. This national body is co-chaired by MYAN and Foundation House. It's a national network, a national cross-sector group that meets regularly to discuss how primary and secondary school students from refugee and migrant backgrounds are faring and how schools can best support them to achieve their potential and engage in educational research and advocacy. And this roundtable includes representatives from all states and territories and a range of sectors, including academia, policy and settlement services. And MYAN and Foundation House have been hosting this group for the last couple of years. So we're really pleased to be hosting today's event on behalf of the roundtable. The Education Roundtable Steering Group has also prepared a briefing paper to accompany today's event, and that's been shared in the last promo material, and we'll also pop a link to that briefing paper in the chat box. This briefing paper was prepared to provide an overview of the barriers to equitable access and engagement in primary and secondary education experienced by students from refugee and migrant backgrounds across Australia. And it also outlines how COVID-19 has highlighted and or magnified or exacerbated these barriers. It provides a point in time identification of the educational issues faced by students, families and educators and schools that limits the full potential of children and young people from migrant and refugee backgrounds, as well as some of the new issues that we've certainly seen gathered from our networks across the country, and those have been magnified by COVID-19. So I should say it's intentionally a brief briefing paper, an outline, a snapshot and a point in time paper to support this event today and other policy and advocacy work. It's a publicly available document and we encourage anyone to access that and utilise it in your advocacy work. Okay, moving on. So the agenda for today, in the first part of this event, we'll be hearing from our panellists who I'll introduce in a moment. They'll each present for about 10 minutes, so quite a comprehensive update. And in the second half, after we've heard from each of the panellists, we'll open the floor to Q&A from all of you. And I'll moderate that through the chat and the Q&A box. So in a moment, I'll hand over to Andrew to run through some tech issues and meeting protocol. But we will ask you to pop your questions in the boxes that we have. I won't be sharing detailed notes from this meeting. So for those of you who have joined some of our other national events, we do sometimes provide detailed notes. We won't be doing that for today, but the discussion today, both the panelist presentations and the Q&A discussion will certainly inform our ongoing policy and advocacy work for Maya and also the National Education Roundtable. All right, over to our fabulous panel today. So first up, we have Dr. Susan Creagh from Queensland, lecturer in the School of Education at UQ. And Susan will be sharing some preliminary findings from current research with EAL, Teachers in Queensland, with some reference to her previous work looking at NAPLAN results, followed by Hala Ramadan. Hala is the principal at Belmore Boys High School in New South Wales, and Hala will bring more of a programming perspective. And I'll let you talk to us about the proportion of students from refugee and migrant backgrounds that you have in your school, Hala, and we'll hear from you about some specific programming initiatives and strategies that you use to support excellent education outcomes for your student cohort in and out of the classroom, so with families and communities also. And we'll also hear from you, given your background in terms of your lived experience and how that influences the work that you do currently. After Hala, Melanie Cutler, who's the team leader in the My Education team at Centre for Multicultural Youth. She'll bring both a policy and programming perspective with a Vic lens. So on the panel, we have a Queensland lens with some, of course, relevance nationally. Hala brings a New South Wales lens. Mel brings a Vic lens. And with a specific focus on policy, sharing some of the observations from the two programs that Melanie runs, which she'll talk about, both in and implications both in terms of current practice and future directions, and some of the lessons or reflections for how we move forward and build on some of the good practice and the excellent initiatives that have emerged in this crisis in very, very, very challenging times. And then the last speaker today is Julie Sonneman, who's the Program Director of School Education at the Grattan Institute. And Julie will bring a national policy perspective. As you can see, Julie is not on our screens at the moment. She's juggling a few webinars this morning. So she'll be jumping off one webinar and joining our webinar at about 11:45. So we look forward to Julie's face on the screen. So over to you, Sue, and thanks again for the panellists for being available today. Over to you, Sue.
Thanks, Nadine. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Sue Cray. I'm from the University of Queensland. I'm in the School of Education and I lecture in teacher education programs. Andrew, we might put the slides up. Yeah. Great. And I want to say what a pleasure it is to be here today. And thank you, Nadine, for inviting me to be a part of this forum. Okay, Andrew, if we can go on to the next slide, please. Okay, I want to do an acknowledgement of country as well from the lands that UQ is built on. These are the lands of the Jagera and the Turrbal people in Queensland. We acknowledge them as traditional owners and they're a custodianship of the lands on which I'm meeting with you today across the country. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Okay, I want to start with a little bit of foundational background knowledge, I guess, that is really important for teachers to know, for us to build into our pre-service teacher programs, because it's this knowledge that I'm interested in relation to the delivery of online learning, which I will get to some research that I've been doing. So I guess, first of all, I make a very strong distinction between literacy and language because they are so often conflated. And literacy approaches, particularly in response to NAPLAN data, don't always address language needs. So I've got a definition up there from Naidoo et al., which really gives a clear distinction between the two of them. The language is the tool that we need. It enables our communication to occur. Literacy is a manifestation of those communications. And the effectiveness of our literacy, our control of literacy, is very much dependent on our language skills, our repertoire of language tools, as they call it. And the smaller our language repertoire, the less efficient our literacy practices. So when we are a teacher of students who are learning English as a second or additional language, we need to target language to help enable them to build literacy. Many EAL students develop very strong social oracy skills. It's quite an astounding thing. That may suggest strong academic language skills as well, but not always. And it's really up to teachers to understand that because the language, the academic language of school is cognitively demanding. It's context reduced. It takes a number of years, and there's been study internationally, there's been study that I've done in Queensland that supports the case that to become strong with academic language takes a number of years and access to an appropriate teaching approach, an appropriate language support. And what does that look like? Well, one of the strong ways in which we build academic language is through classroom-based scaffolded discussion. So this is where we have deep, meaningful conversations about learning, which enables students to move from their existing knowledge to the new academic knowledge that they need to have to engage across the curriculum in the various curriculum concepts. This kind of discussion translates then into written tasks, etc. But it allows students to be engaged with high challenge learning whilst they're being supported or scaffolded is the term that we might use. So that's kind of the foundational stuff that I want you to keep in your head as I now move into some of the research that I have done. So Andrew, if we can go to the next slide, please. So this research is work I've been doing for a number of years now, starting with my PhD. So I'm calling it pre-COVID research. But what I did was to unpack NAPLAN data for language learners to show that that very broad LBOAT category that is reported on when we get our NAPLAN results hides enormous diversity in the learner group. So we've got a really high performance by some highly educated migrant students, something to be applauded, of course. It's a great thing that they're doing that. But their performance on that test actually sort of drags an average up and hides some deeply disadvantaged students who are not doing so well in that category. It's a statistical problem, I think, that hides students who are predominantly of refugee background or have refugee-like visas, refugee visas or refugee-like visa categories. But I want to stress it's not about being a refugee per se. That's not, that category is a vehicle for enabling me to get in and count and do the numbers. But it's about prior educational opportunities and whether or not someone has had the opportunity to develop literacy in their first language. So yes, I want to stress it's not about being a refugee, but it's about what opportunities these students have had in terms of their education, and also potentially traumatic experiences that can impact on learning. So how do we address this? So my most recent research that I've been doing, also pre-COVID, has been to work in an intensive English centre to try and document the practices that happen in there and the length of time that students are allowed to have, you know, access to that intensive English program. And my particular interest is in students who come into the country as teenagers, as young adults, who've had very limited prior schooling. And what we've found there is that those students have needed a much longer intensive specialist program. Now in Queensland, I know it's different depending on the policy context in other states and territories, but in Queensland, there has been capacity for those students to stay in that intensive program for longer. And some of them have had, you know, 60 to 80 weeks where they've needed quite a long time in the very beginning stages of their English language learning program to lay down foundational language and literacy skills in English as an additional language. And that's enabled them then to sort of build some of those skills that they then need to take into the classroom. Now, the thing is, though, that isn't enough. And what we need is, of course, continued support. So I just want to sort of flag here that in terms of what I'm seeing in my research, I think, yes, we absolutely need to improve how we count and identify these students and disaggregate this information a little bit more in a more refined way so that the educational response is more appropriate, more adequate. But we also need to be able to apply language pedagogy in our classrooms for longer. And that means not just having a good pool of EAL specialists, but professional development for all teachers for long-term language support in mainstream settings. That's absolutely essential, but I'd have to say that it is something that is not prioritised necessarily in teacher education programs enough. So knowing all of that, what about online delivery of learning? What does that mean with all of this that we already know about what's important and what we need to be doing? So can we go to the next slide, please, Andrew? So now the research that I've done this year has been with Queensland EAL specialist teachers across primary, secondary, and the migrant education program at TAFE, 21 teachers in all. And I want to just flag that I don't have student voices in this. This is a limitation, of course, of this research, but it's also been out of necessity because of the restrictions on being able to access students and the incredible difficulties this year of being able to get student voices into research. So the research project was really to try and understand how learning was being delivered online for EAL students. How were they managing, given that I've noted that, you know, we need those kind of classroom discussions, we need that academic talk happening to support, and how does that happen online? There's also, I guess, this expectation that schools, I think the media has portrayed schools as being ready to bounce into online delivery, that it was all pretty easy in a way, and that we're ready to go the minute it happens again. You know, we just close the school down and the kids will all log on to online learning and everything's great. So I had 4 questions, which was really about how did the students, the EALD students in Queensland, engage with learning during the school closure? What teaching and learning approaches were most effective for the engagement of learners? What enabled their progress for academic English? And what challenges were there for them in situations where it was online delivery or where the mode of delivery was not necessarily face-to-face classroom learning, because not everyone could actually do online learning. All right, if we can go to the final slide, please. Andrew, that'd be great. And I just can only flag preliminary findings at this stage because I'm still doing interviews and I'm still, doing the analysis of the data. But just from what I've gained from the conversations that I've had with teachers, there were some pluses, of course. There was certainly an effort by schools that were represented by my teachers to audit the technology needs of students and, if possible, to provide them with laptops or devices to have at home. Less so in terms of the internet connectability. I think that was not so well done for a range of reasons. I found that some schools had already transitioned to online learning platforms pre-COVID. And where that was the case, there was, much more possibility for this transition to be less challenging for students. They kind of already understood how to engage with the software, where to find the teaching materials, etc. Particularly in primary schools, I found the EAL teachers reported closer connections being built with some of the families, the EAL families. The EAL teacher in the school was the point of contact for many of the EAL families in the primary school context. Within the adult groups, the AMEP programs, some of those teachers reported there was a really a nice bonding of the class group through technology and much more peer support if engaging with technology. I found many of the teachers had to become flexible with technology. They had to find things that worked and they had to accept that some things just didn't work. And it was really a message of evolution through using programs, through going sort of hard with more complex stuff and then going, no, this is not working. We've got to pull it back. It's got to be simpler. And despite the schools being in lockdown, and I was just mentioning earlier, in Queensland, we had a 5-week lockdown. So certainly not as long as New South Wales and nowhere near as long as Victoria. Regardless of that, many schools identified their most at-risk students and those students were invited to be at school. So teachers were on the school grounds, but there were still students who were able to access school for a range of reasons. So what were some of the challenges? Some of the students were missing, of course. They were disengaged. They were difficult to reach by phone. Where schools could, the schools that I spoke to, if they had multilingual staff, they were the point of contact, but it didn't always reach everybody. I think the report that mine have produced flags is too that, of course, there's limited home support with technology, challenges with internet access. There may have been too many kids in the family, in the house, to all have access to the technology that they needed to be able to access the learning. Some of my teachers noted that, in this type of approach, the learning is much more unstructured. It's very reliant on students knowing this is how we learn in Australian schools. And for those students newer to the country, it was very difficult to kind of manage how you learn in this unstructured, more online setting, particularly if they're still learning about how Australian schools work. Some teachers flagged the exhausting challenge of trying to help all of their students in their various levels of language need by designing appropriate tasks, getting work back from students, generating new work for them. So being responsive to where they were at was very difficult to do in the online setting. Very limited opportunities for spoken interaction, so we weren't able to simulate those kind of classroom discussions. I found no uniformity across platforms being used. It seemed to be very much a school-based decision. There seemed to be no guidance from above about this is what we're all using, etc. And of course, there are good things about that and maybe some challenges around that. But it's also then difficult to identify what are the best options. The Queensland teachers reported that after 5 weeks of that home learning or online learning, the kids were really depleted. They were over it and they were not completing work, particularly in the secondary context. They were quite disengaged. So it was a welcoming time for them to come back to school where the learning really needed to be revisited in some places. Okay, so that's me done. I hope I haven't used up too much time, but I look forward to any questions that you might have following the other presenters. So thank you.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Sue. Certainly haven't used up too much time. There's already a couple of questions for you that I've seen in the Q&A. What we will do is hear from all the panellists and then come back to the questions. So if you have specific questions for panellists, please pop them into the Q&A box as we go. We'll certainly come back to those. Yeah, and thank you, Sue, really comprehensive in a really small space of time. Thank you. Hala, over to you, which I think is a really neat follow on from some of the points that Sue made.
Definitely. Can I just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this beautiful land where this meeting is taking place and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I would also like to send my respect to all the cultural backgrounds represented here with us today. And I would also like to send a message of gratitude to Indigenous communities for allowing someone like me to call Australia home. My name is Hala Ramadan. I'm the principal of Belmore Boys High School. I've been in this position for 5 years, and we have seen huge change at my school since the time I've arrived, along with a new senior executive team. A little bit of a background. I am a migrant myself. 31 years ago, we arrived to Australia, and I went to school basically for 3 years before I went on to university and completed my credentials. I've been in education for 23 years, so I'll just start my talk with the fact that over the last 23 years, I've worked in schools that are very similar to my school, different issues, but very similar in terms of the clientele. So I've worked in single-sex and co-ed settings, but all of these settings were settings of high diversity. So the student population would be, between 90 and 100% if you want, NESB. The majority were low SES settings as well, including my current setting. So in terms of any decision making, I guess, that happens here at my school, it happens and it's informed by two different pathways. The very first one, or two different, experiences, I guess. The very first one is my personal experience as a migrant who came out here on a humanitarian program, so very similar to refugee experiences, but also it comes from the experience that I've gained from working in those settings over the last 23 years. So if we look at, my personal experience, I guess, first-hand experience, I know what it's like to come out here and not speak a word of English and feel like, okay, it's all beautiful and pretty and quiet, but I don't belong, I don't fit. I was the first in my family to go through higher education, so that was a foreign experience for myself and for my family in terms of supporting me, I guess. I had limited access to the curriculum because of my language issues. I had a lot of self-doubt and issues with self-belief that I can actually do that. I sort of struggled a little bit with the victim mentality rather than survivor mentality, if you want. As I sort of, started my new life in Australia. And I had to come to an understanding, I guess, as a school leader in terms of the importance of me being a principal in this job and me having this experience, I guess. And I had to really get over my self-doubt, if you want, in this position and understand that I have a huge role to play and that the difference that I would be making would no longer be making with my immediate classroom or immediate faculty, but it's actually a school-wide difference. And I decided, I guess, at that point that I would use every interaction with a staff member, a community member, a student as a learning opportunity for all. So that's a little bit of the personal side. So if we look at the professional side, if you want, in terms of observations of needs and complexities and challenges in those settings that I've been at for the last 23 years. Language barriers, of course, low access to resources and what's available to families at home. Quite a lot of our kids have come from families that are large with limited resources. There's lack of access to, or limited access, if you want, to positive role models, to people who've walked the walk before, and for those kids to follow in those footsteps. A lot of my kids have a lot of additional responsibilities that the normal teenage boy doesn't necessarily have. We have basically lack of alignment between expectations of home and school, lack of understanding of school systems. All of these were issues that sort of I've collected along the way in terms of the settings that I've worked at, and they were very consistent with what I noticed here. We also have a significant population of my school that come from refugee backgrounds, in particular with trauma. And if we look at the students or the families that have refugee-like experiences, that 10% jumps to 60 or 70 or 80% very, very quickly. Okay, so in terms of how we did things at my school pre-COVID and post-COVID, I guess. So when I arrived at my school, we were a school of 285 students, a very rundown school, and a school that had gone through a significant change at a leadership level and had lost community image and community trust, if you want. So I arrived here, and it was actually one of the students that asked me, couldn't you get a better job? Why are you here? And when I questioned why he would be saying something like that, he said, look around you. And to me, that flagged the very first thing that I needed to work on. I realised that our kids, our boys, don't really have a connection with their environment, the school environment. And I realised that they don't have much pride in the environment that they were in. And that was significantly affecting their learning and their commitment or, drive to learn. So student wellbeing was a very first, was an area that we really needed to look at as a school. I was in a really good position with a new senior executive team to be looking at things differently and putting in place things that were not done, I guess, prior to my arrival. So we decided that every interaction with our kid with a kid at our school, it's going to be a talk about how our diversity and our difference is about richness and strength. We are survivors rather than victims. We bring a lot to the table rather than we don't fit and we don't belong. In addition to that, so that was in the general talk, I guess, that we were doing with our kids. In addition to that, if we wanted our kids to have pride in this environment that they're in, then that environment needed to do a lot of work. We needed to do a lot of work with it. So we started working on our physical environment, if you want, of the school. We went from not a very nice looking school and now we actually look really, really nice, and the kids really appreciate the work that we've done. We've got a lot of sort of green around the place. We've got gardens, we've got rooftop gardens, we've fixed up our sporting fields. We actually painted the school ourselves. I found myself on my knees in my first holiday as a principal scrubbing paint off the carpet because the school at that point was not in a financial place to hire external people. With that, we had a lot of ownership, of course, and we had a lot of support from community and staff and kids, and it sort of, made us feel more like a family, and that's something that we take pride in as a school. We call ourselves the Belmore family, and now we're a Belmore village because we've gotten much bigger than a family. So, as I said, student wellbeing was on our forefront. We also decided that we're going to celebrate everyone. We're a school of 36 languages. Our kids can't afford to go to things like the Easter show, so we decided the Easter show will come to us. So we would organise our own Easter show. We'd celebrate our own Chinese New Year. We had Multicultural Day that celebrated a whole, everyone basically. We had an iftar dinner that celebrated our Muslim kids. So during the month of fasting, we'd hold a very humble dinner of 500 people, if you want. So the whole community would come together and we'd have this dinner that's run by staff and students. We'd have a community breakfast that, invites everyone in terms of service providers to our school to see how things are done. And we basically raised awareness around anything and everything. Now, there's one particular thing that I want to talk about in terms of migrant communities, and that was my personal experience as well as what I noticed, is that we have very limited understanding in terms of Indigenous communities and Aboriginal communities. So In 2016, I connected with a very lovely principal at Menindee Central Way, a school that I visited, and I was overwhelmed by the sense of community and family and generosity that they demonstrated. So we kept the links over the years, and we decided that we would host events for Aboriginal communities that came to us from Menindee, but also from all around Sydney. We held, so we decided that if we wanted change to last, we could do things at the student level, but we needed to do things at the family level as well. So we invited parents to come and spend a day out with our parents here, and we went around different areas in Sydney, and that seemed to build those bridges and build that understanding about the similarities rather than differences. I think sometimes we focus too much on difference rather than similarities. Different cultures have, and bringing people together, I think, is always a winner in my eyes anyway, if we want to make a serious change in society. Now, so that was student wellbeing. We then decided to look at our curriculum and our teacher learning program. It was all fine and good that we were doing a lot of learning with our teachers here, but it was only happening at a school level, and we decided that the teachers coming out here needed to have that knowledge and that information before they came out to schools like ours. So I connected with Sydney University, and I worked with someone in the cultural diversity unit, and I started hosting talks at the school and at the university to build that understanding about the complexities and the rewards of working with our clientele. In addition to that, we looked at how we can make our curriculum a little bit more accessible and diverse in terms of the subject offerings that we're doing. So we're a proud school that runs a subject like agriculture, for example, and I think we are the only one in the area that have agriculture running, and it's been a very successful program. We actually have classes now from year 9 to year 12. Then we basically looked at our employment in terms of teachers, and we needed to be very deliberate in seeking out the best possible teachers for our kids. All kids deserve great teachers, of course, but with my kids, we really needed to focus on how we're going to reach all kids in the skills-based pathway, but also the academic pathway. And then we decided to take it a step further and put on an educational program for families. So we ran courses. So we joined forces with TAFE, and we ran courses in floristry, English skills, computer, sewing, educational support. And we actually even employed a couple of our parents here. And it was more about changing the lives of those kids, but also the families. It was about our boys seeing their mums as lifelong learners as well. Now, post-COVID, all of this work that we did, I guess, developed a relationship of trust and support with our families, and our families saw us as a service provider rather than just a school. So over COVID, things changed very quickly, of course. And we had to focus on mental health as a priority for our kids, for our families, and for our staff. Our staff are actually, representatives of the community that we're in. So we do have staff from diverse communities. So during lockdown, we actually had to connect with a number of service providers to provide counselling for a lot of kids. We had to monitor very closely, classrooms, online classrooms, to see who's presenting with some issues. We made calls every single day to a lot of kids. I had teaching and non-teaching staff working on calling families and making sure that kids are okay, and supporting the families in the online learning. Of course, our kids didn't have devices and didn't have enough devices and didn't have internet and so on. So, of course, we had to produce a lot of learning packs, and we did learning packs as they would get them at school. And we would deliver the learning packs and make sure that the learning packs are collected and marked and so on. With the loss of income in a lot of families, we found ourselves also teaming up with a lot of service providers to make sure that those families are able to pay bills, are able to have food on their tables, and we even supported families who basically presented with an increase of DV or issues at home. So we found ourselves doing a lot of one-on-one counselling on the phone, if you want, between teachers and non-teaching staff and kids, but also between key people in the school and parents. I think, and this is just like a sprint, if you want, in terms of what we've done. But I think all the work that we did pre-COVID really reinforced the sense of care and support that we have for our family. And if we look at where we were in 2016 and where we are now, we were a school of 285. We're about 500 now. So we've nearly doubled in numbers. And in spite of all the complexities and the challenges, I guess, and the daily things that we face as a school, I guess, at the end of the day, our kids and our families know that they can come to us for whatever the support they need is, and they will be referred onto the service that they need, or they'll be supported in whatever way we can actually do. Now, in terms of filling the gaps for our learners, of course, there are additional classes before and after school. There was lots of tutoring through my staff, but also we sought tutors from local universities that we had existing programs with, and they were coming out here and working closely with the kids to fill the gaps, I guess, that they've had. It was challenging for our parents having the kids at home, because our parents also could not support our kids with the learning quite a lot of the time. So they expressed their fears and concerns to us, and we were able to help, I guess, in whatever capacity we could. So this is just what I guess I'll talk about now. Maybe there'll be other things that we will mention as we go through questions.
Terrific. Thanks, Hala. That's a really comprehensive overview, and I think you've certainly picked up on some key aspects of good practice in the school setting, family and community connections, and all of that work that you put in prior to a health crisis like we've had that has certainly put your school and your school community in good stead for successfully navigating the crisis that we've all been through. Yeah, thank you, Hala. And yeah, plenty of time for some other questions. I'm going to hand over now to Mel Cutler from Centre for Multicultural Youth in Melbourne. Thanks, Mel.
Thanks, Nadine. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be with you all today. And I want to start too by telling you that I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri land, right on the outskirts of Melbourne, and I would like to acknowledge and pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I also want to say a big thanks to Sue and Hala. I so thoroughly enjoyed listening to both of you. I feel like I learned something new from both of you. I love hearing those different perspectives, but also there's a lot that overlaps and rings true with our thoughts and our learnings at CMY in Victoria too. So I think that's really encouraging. So I'll just be sharing a few reflections essentially about learnings from my perspective over the last 6 months, particularly. But a couple of notes about my context before I launch in. So I work at the Centre for Multicultural Youth, as Nadine mentioned. So we're a Victorian-based NGO that offers a wide range of programs in the multicultural youth space, everything from direct casework to youth leadership programs to a range of capacity building work in different sectors across the state to policy and advocacy work as well. I lead the education team at CMY, and the bulk of our work is delivering 2 key programs that are both funded by the Victorian Department of Education and Training. They're both long-running programs and they both have a capacity building focus. The first is the Refugee Education Support Program, or RESP. We love a good acronym in our team, so make sure to spell them out for you. RESP is a program, it's a capacity building program for schools. We deliver it in partnership with Foundation House, the Catholic Education Commission of Victoria and Independent Schools Victoria. It's quite a structured program that schools participate in for a set 2-year period, and it encourages them to holistically reflect on the way their school supports and engages students and families of refugee background. And that's done in a whole range of ways across different levels and parts of the school. The second program that our team delivers at CMY is Learning Beyond the Bell, which is also a capacity building program, but in the outside school hours learning support space. So Colloquially, they're referred to as homework clubs, but in actual fact, the sector in Victoria that's in this outside school hours space is very diverse, and the shape and context and settings and size and format of programs is really mixed. There's between 350 and 400 programs that are on our database that we support in a range of ways: free training, resources, advice, connecting and networking for program coordinators. So that's kind of a different perspective, I guess, that sits alongside our work with schools. And the other important piece of context, I think, in terms of my reflections today, is the length of the lockdown and the remote learning period for schools in Victoria. Even with my own daughter in prep, I was trying to think back and through our diary. It's hard to keep track of all the weeks we've come and gone. But as best as I can figure out, for students in Victoria in years 3 to 10, they're sitting at around 20 weeks that they had to work and learn remotely across terms 2, 3 and 4. So not that far off half a year's worth of learning. And the Prep 1s, 2s and VCE students are more around that 13, 14 week mark. So really significant periods of time in a couple of chunks with some face-to-face in between. And that certainly impacts the shape of my reflections today. Also, before I begin, I did want to acknowledge that a feature of the way that the system responded, I suppose, in terms of the school system, is that it wasn't consistent across schools, which I guess isn't really surprising because there's a lot of autonomy generally in the way schools operate. But an example of this, I thought, was at the beginning of the whole process. I don't know if other states were similar, but the Department of Education put out some guidance around the support of vulnerable or at-risk students and how they might be able to be provided with other types of learning, potentially face-to-face at school. Different schools interpreted that and created their own definition of vulnerable and then therefore responded quite differently. And that meant that the shape of support looked really different at different schools for students of EAL or refugee or migrant background. So whilst I'm essentially, I guess, commenting on a collection of themes or trends, I'm aware that there wasn't that strong consistency across the sector, and of course there also wasn't perfect consistency across individual family and student experiences. So I think I would describe what I'm commenting on as trends with exceptions. And to jump right in now, the first, which not surprisingly has come up from both Sue and Hala as well, is family engagement. And for me, or for us at CMY, the COVID and the remote learning experience really highlighted what we already knew, but how crucial the family engagement piece of the puzzle is to meaningful learning for students. And I think it highlighted the importance of that. It also highlighted the gaps where that was in certain schools. And I think generally we could say that the experience that schools had was often based on the strength of the pre-existing relationships. So interesting to hear Hala talk, and to me that just rings true that all that work that went in beforehand provided you with a strong foundation to continue that engagement. And we certainly worked with a range of schools that were in the trickier situation where it kind of highlighted some gaps and made the work much harder to try and build those relationships from a lesser starting point. And another kind of element, I suppose, is not only family engagement, but it's connected, that I wanted to comment on was the role of bicultural or bilingual workers, which get lots of different names in Victoria, but they're often referred to as MEAs or multicultural education aides. But whatever their name may be, the roles, and actually their roles are quite diverse as well, they're not consistent. But it was clear that they were heavily relied upon by schools to do the family engagement piece, and not just that, but actually potentially the student engagement piece for students of refugee and migrant backgrounds during the remote learning period. And the key comments there were that, of course, they were sometimes the difference between it really working and it really not, but that there was a real lack of consistency across the spectrum in terms of expectations of those staff members, and broadly, a lot of reports back around overwork and blurred boundaries and over-reliance. And whilst a key point I want to make is how crucial and wonderful the support that those kinds of roles in a school can provide, there is a risk of them becoming a fix-all, and that their role coming at the expense of capacity building work across the whole school staff. But in the family engagement and MEA or bilingual worker space, I think the key point would be that whilst it did highlight some challenges, it also, I think, presents us with a really amazing opportunity to realise the value of them, to invest further in the support of them and the guidance for schools actually in how to use them effectively, as well as advocacy more broadly to invest in more roles like that in schools that need them. And excitingly, as part of the recent Victorian government announcement to do with some of their education recovery, there is space there. There is an allocation for 60 new workers of this type. Not much detail yet about where they'll be or what they'll really do, but that's a really good first step, I think. The second theme I wanted to just mention was the space of disengagement, which again has already been touched on, with the key points I think being that, of course, particularly in Victoria, this huge length of time has resulted in a heightened risk of schools losing students that were maybe on the cusp of disengaging beforehand, and the extended period of time away has meant they've really fallen off connection with the school. And some of the key pieces of feedback from our client-facing staff at CMY are that the year levels that this is affecting are getting earlier and earlier. So, for example, a program at CMY that works with Pacifica young people are reporting that year 7, year 8 age group as being really, really critical, and schools reporting losing engagement with some of those students. And the other thing being that a lot of the existing program responses, so there's a Victorian program called Navigator, which is state-funded re-engagement program, but the trigger point for that is 70% non-attendance, and our casework staff are reporting that that's often too late. So I would say in this space, again, COVID has highlighted and exacerbated some risks that probably many of those students were already on the cusp of facing, but that it also presents us with an opportunity to reflect on how we might do this differently because it's more pivotal than ever. And I think the key messages I'm hearing in that space are really think earlier in terms of both year levels and student ages, but also trigger points for connecting in with supports, and get creative with what that might look like in a post-COVID 2021 reconnecting kind of space. So not surprisingly, as we get to the end of the school year, everyone's attention is starting to turn to 2021. What's our response going to be? Certainly the government, the Victorian Department of Education has started to put out some announcements from that kind of level perspective, but schools are having that conversation too. Us as a capacity building organisation are having those conversations too. And I just wanted to mention a couple of notes, I guess, that are in that space, that forward-looking kind of space. One being just wanting to note the risk or the potential tendency to a one-size-fits-all approach, even when we're talking about disadvantage, and how important it is to tailor responses to the different cohorts of different types of disadvantage. I think an example of that is, as part of that announcement I mentioned earlier, the Department of Education of Victoria has announced a really huge tutoring program, which Julie, you might talk to, because I know that was on the back of some great advocacy from Grattan. It's really exciting news. It's a really big investment in 4,000 tutors across the school year. And certainly our work in the Learning Beyond the Bell program knows that we know that kind of small focused learning support can be hugely powerful. But the key message there, I think, would be how important it is to deliver it with a tailored approach and to understand student context specifically. So for us, for CMY, that will be really important to be trying to work alongside the department and also schools to help them implement that tutoring program in a way that actually really works for their EAL or refugee migrant students. The last little forward-looking note was around, as I mentioned at the top, the experience wasn't consistent across the board. And actually for some EAL students, there were some really positive learning outcomes from the remote learning experience. And so I'd love to see that being taken as an opportunity to reflect on how ongoing use of flexible mixed mode delivery learning support could actually be used in a long-term sense when they actually add value for these students. So I think there are definitely some challenges ahead, and 2021 is going to be a very interesting year, I think, for the Victorian education sector. But my sense would be if our responses are based on a foundation of effective family engagement, if we're targeting the investment and response where we know things work, and if we're differentiating those responses to actually meet the different types of disadvantage, then actually this whole experience potentially has provided us with an opportunity to reflect and then to strengthen our education approach in terms of the support of refugee and migrant students far beyond the actual recovery from COVID, but looking much more longer term. And I think that's actually really exciting. So thanks. That's it from me.
Terrific. Thanks, Mel. That was great. And I'd feel a bit compelled just to add in one of those learnings that I've certainly heard both from young people in our networks and also teaching staff, is that actually the remote learning has required teaching staff to engage with families in ways that they haven't been sort of compelled to do in the past. And some good outcomes of that has been a better understanding of the family context in sort of real terms for some school communities, which I think is incredibly important. Thanks, Mel, and welcome, Julie. Terrific to have you. Thank you once again for juggling your webinars this morning. So Julie is the Program Director of School Education at Grattan Institute, and over to you, Julie.
Great, thanks Nadine, and apologies for my tardiness, and I just got the end of Mel's comments there, and sounds like you're having a really interesting discussion. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. I might just quickly try and share a few slides with you. I promise I won't do death by PowerPoint, but at the Grattan Institute, we are an independent think tank, and our sort of mandate is that we look to what is the evidence saying around what works in school education and what does the data say. And then we make high-level recommendations to governments on how they can better support schools, teachers and students. So that's sort of where we look at some of these issues from. So I'm sort of starting at that lens, and hence why I'm just trying to explain why I'm using some PowerPoints. But this is a really interesting area, one that's close to my own heart. And I have to say, when I have looked at some of the growth scores that come out of NAPLAN, and there's some really interesting findings around students who, unfortunately, NAPLAN, you can only cut it by language background other than English, so it doesn't perfectly capture migrants and refugees, but captures a proportion of that group. You know, there's some real strengths in this whole area that we need to learn from, and I think it's actually a really key issue for the Australian system and community more broadly, is that there's a lot that we can learn from migrants and refugees, particularly around their work ethic and their motivation to learn and succeed in life in another country. And I think we don't see enough of this in our education system, and I think this is a great opportunity where we can change that. So I thought to just open up, I just wanted to touch on a few points in my time slot. One is that, you know, there are real strengths of this group, but obviously it's a diverse group. So when I'm talking about some of our work, and I just thought to double check, can you see the slides? Yep, great. Obviously there's a lot of diverse needs within the refugee and migrant group. And Australia has a composition of migrants and refugees that is quite different to a lot of other countries. And it is quite sort of well stated by organisations like the OECD that, and Australia is quite unusual actually in terms of some of the high growth rates that you see at school in terms of student results with our migrant community. So you can see in this first chart that, you know, clearly our WOTE students perform a lot better than your sort of typical average Australian student. And that happens in numeracy in particular at both primary and secondary. Reading, probably less so. This is just in terms of raw achievement levels. What's really interesting, I think, about the data, and I'll just try and, is that actually when you look at growth measures, so which is different to achievement on that first slide, which is really like how much are the same students improving from say 7 to 9, which is a more accurate indication of how much students are actually learning while they're at school. you can clearly see that actually in reading, it's both in reading and numeracy that this group outperform the typical Australian student. That is huge, and these differences are really large. It's very difficult to pick up any kind of discrepancies like this by group. So there's something here that we can all learn from. Having said that, we do know that obviously it's a very diverse group, and that as a trend, as an average, students who do experience disadvantage in the home, unfortunately, do tend to make much lower levels of growth. So this sort of complicated looking chart really just shows you some of the growth over a 2-year period with increasing. So the dots on the right-hand side are schools that are more advantaged. And so you're looking at your more disadvantaged schools on the left-hand side. You can clearly see that there's lower rates of growth over a 2-year period. So some students are making only a year and a half worth over 2 years, for example. This is really important because there is this narrative at the moment, and it just comes from a quirk in the way that the NAPLAN scale is interpreted, that some academics do sort of say, you know, the big issue is cruising schools, advantaged schools. They're not actually adding value to students. Actually, what this chart shows you is that it's the exact opposite. Advantaged schools are adding a lot of growth while students are at school. It's by far the biggest issue is disadvantaged schools. So this chart just, I guess, shows some of the data that I think is, again, an average. So I think what has been really positive, and what Mel was just talking to, was that there has been some really positive findings that have come out of COVID in terms of interactions with the parents and parents' engagement in student education. I'd love to hear more about that. It's certainly not been the experience that has been seen to date in terms of the data when data has been collected from students and parents. So I actually found these stats quite shocking, because if you look at it, it does show that if students are from a lower socioeconomic background, they do get less help at home from their parents with their schoolwork. They, for whatever reason, and it's obviously not inherent, but they do express lower levels of motivation to learn at a certain point in time. And they do obviously just have some of those just practical barriers for accessing the internet or having a quiet place to study. A lot of these things would have undoubtedly have made some students' learning experiences much more challenging. And when you look at some of the teacher survey data, it was coming out relatively strongly in the differences between more advantaged schools and lower socioeconomic schools, that teachers there felt that in lower socioeconomic schools, the majority of teachers thought that students were learning at about 25 to 50% of their regular pace, whereas in a higher socioeconomic school, they were learning at around 50 to 75% of their regular pace. And these are obviously, again, averages. I want to take a strengths-based approach here, but I also think we need to be realistic and make sure that we're providing the right levels of support for students who might be needing it, which is part of the reason why we have advocated so hard for extra investment at this point in time, particularly given we're going to recession. There's likely to be lower government money available in future for any priority, and so given all this stimulus money was going out the door, this was the time to actually say, can we kind of nab some of that for education? This chart here just shows you what happens to the equity gap when you look at some of the studies on when students are at home and they're not at school learning, for in the cases of snow closures or summer holidays, and really we built off a literature review that was done by the Education Endowment Foundation. It took a very high level of rigour to the evidence, and basically does show that, in those cases when children are away from school, the equity gap grows, which makes sense. The kids who have experienced more advantage in the home will get further ahead, and the kids who have less will get further behind, and it increases fast. So over the first period of shutdown in Melbourne, over the 2-month period, it was growing it more than likely would have grown about 3 times the rate. And it actually lines up to what some of the teacher survey data was telling us as well, which is just good to be able to calibrate based on sort of various data points. And I think what Mel also mentioned is that this a real benefit of this whole experience has been that it has shone a light on equity and the existing equity gap. And really, and I think this chart talks to that, like, yes, the gap has grown 3 times as fast during remote schooling, but actually, if you look at it in the context of the regular gap, so if you look at that chart on the right-hand side, in December, it is very normal for a student in year 5 to be 18 months behind, a disadvantaged student to be 18 months behind an advantaged student in Australia. So they're already a year and a half, and that grows to about 3 years by year 9 from our work. So we're talking about COVID, you know, would have added maybe 1 to 2 months extra during that first wave in Victoria, probably another couple of months extra on the gap in that second wave. But really, you're talking about adding maybe 4 months on top of years. So, and I think there's a goodwill at the moment because all parents have, from a political perspective, all parents have just been at home with their students and they realise, A, how hard teaching is, and B, how important it is. And they have that empathy. And I really don't think it's a coincidence that we've actually seen the government invest a huge amount in education as a one-off in tutoring at this point in time, because I think it's something that resonates with voters. Just a little bit, my last point would just be on our work in this space. And part of the reason why we did recommend small group tuition was just when you look at the trials and the evidence coming out of that, it's very positive in terms of its impact on learning. It was also able to be scaled quickly, and that was our second criteria, and that was really important given basically the money that's available will need to be spent, and also kids are behind. So it's hard, you know, there's a lot of more fundamental issues, I think, in the education system that need to be addressed, but now is maybe not the time to address those. You actually just need to work with what you've got and help students catch up best you can. The one thing, and just with the small group tuition, the thing that I find that was actually a learning for me doing this project was it's really not cost effective. And as an economist, that I find it really interesting when you see governments make decisions trying to be cost effective. So there's been big investments just all around the country and generally in like programs and interventions that impact the whole class and whole school. You know, it's very much whole school. And a lot of that is because, you know, okay, so we'll spend this much, and then because it's delivering this much benefits to so many children, this is great. But what has been not emphasised in that is that actually implementation in education is really hard. And so sometimes it can be better to go with something that's actually expensive, and we know that there's more success in implementation than something that's cheaper but less certain. So that's where we landed. I think just quickly in terms of migrants and refugees, I would hope that there is potential for some of this money to really be tailored to the needs of this group, and certainly it's intended to be. At the moment, they're looking through the design of the program, and I've been talking a little bit with the department, and it is very much, you know, schools will get this allocation, schools will decide how they want to spend it. So there's a lot of scope there. Probably the only constraints at this point is that schools need to be using a qualified teacher as a tutor or a pre-service teacher. I don't know how that plays with some of the English language as a second learner. Sorry, you know what I mean. Small groups that focus on English language, and you know, I presume that maybe some of those groups aren't always led by a qualified teacher. If that's the case, I would strongly be encouraging you to approach the government with some of those concerns, because they are open and they will need to be thinking outside the box on workforce. They are learning as they go in rolling out this initiative, and I actually think schools are going to have a lot of freedom to spend money as they wish. So, and I have had conversations where, particularly in remote and regional areas, or where there's just not a qualified teacher around, paraprofessionals will be okay. Qualified teacher actually wasn't our recommendation for this. We think it could be thrown open to paraprofessionals as well, because there's been similar benefits experienced in trials of small group tuition. So I think that is, if there is expertise that sits within people like that, then I would encourage schools to be using them, particularly where they're useful for tailored approaches. So I might end there, because I feel like I've probably taken up quite a bit of time, and I think some of the other points have been covered by the other speakers to date, but I'm interested in any questions or discussion further.
Thanks, Julie. No, great. And the PowerPoint slides are most welcome. And to let you know that we haven't had four sets of PowerPoints, so very complimentary. Just before we move into the Q&A, and really want to use most of the time that we have left today for some Q&A, and there's some great questions that have been coming in since your presentation first up, Susan. But I think just a summary on some of the key points, there's a data collection issue here that those of us who have worked in this space for some time understand deeply and loud and clear, that we have NAPLAN data that isn't accurately capturing and reflecting the diverse experiences of this refugee and migrant student cohort. I think that's one thing that's not new. We know that more work, and across the board, we need better data collection to inform evidence-based responses in policy and programming. I think the second thing is, as you highlighted, Julie, but everyone else has spoken to this, and Hala and Mel, you gave some really practical examples of programs in this area. We need increased and targeted investment to support the educational outcomes of this cohort. And this cohort, and I noticed that it's come up in the chat box, and I'm glad it has, this cohort is not just a disadvantaged or vulnerable cohort. So we need to balance that language, because there are some realities around access and equity barriers that create disadvantage or vulnerability. But actually this cohort are strong, capable communities. And as a few of you have already highlighted, this group of young, in fact, Julie, you spoke to it as well, this group of young people are often extremely highly motivated to succeed in education. And what we know from our work directly with young people, education is one of the top 3 issues of concern for them. They want it to be better. They see it as a really critical tool for successful lives in terms of accessing social, economic, civic participation and other opportunities. We need to properly invest to ensure that this group of students receive the support that they need. And related, just picking up on your point, Hala, and you spoke about it too, Sue, is the importance in investing in professional development and capacity building with teaching staff, and more broadly, as you spoke about, Hala. So, you know, I just want to highlight those points. There's work to do, you know, across the board, both in research, policy, evidence-based building to inform programming. But we also know what we need to do in the programming area based on good practice and outcomes and successes that we see in local communities. All right, so I'm going to head to the Q&A box here. There's a few comments and questions, and I'm going to jump straight to Greg Gow, which is a question for you, Sue. And just by the way, to all the audience, I'll try and move through all of these questions. I know Atem has popped out for a bit and may well be back, so I'll come back to his question. But straight up, Greg Gow's question to you, Sue. How do we counter commentators arguing that educational disadvantage is about being a refugee?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's any of those stereotypes that sit with, you know, the high achieving, highly motivated Asian learner and then the failing refugee. I tried to flag that in my presentation, Greg, that to me, it's not the category of being a refugee per se, it's about educational opportunities. And that we just have to keep steering back to that notion of, you know, what access to education have these students had before they've come to Australia, what access to learning a language, what access to learning a literacy in their first language. Those are the factors. And until we start measuring and counting those kinds of factors, we can only go back to these quasi indicators, which are not particularly helpful. So in your setting, I would just be always pulling back to educational experience to talk about this group of learners. So I hope that sort of helps.
Great, thanks, Sue. And I'm going to jump down to a question from Mira again about data, and it may be that you've covered this. So Mira's question, in amongst some context, is there any way to determine the LBOTE category, the LBOTE category, to determine student outcomes, attendance, retention rates and NAPLAN results?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a very big project. So there's very little we can do in interrogating the ACARA LVOTE data. When I did my research, I had to go to Queensland state-based data, and the department were very supportive of that. But to get that kind of information around attendance and retention, you actually have to work with state departments and then link that into LVOTE performance. And also, if possible, you need to link in indicators of language background, which are generally not collected. Certainly educational background is not uniformly collected on enrolment forms. It's something that is sometimes asked. There's certainly no capacity to collect information, as far as I'm aware, around English language learning. So you have to then go to visa categories if they are correctly collected, depending on who does enrolments in schools. It's a tricky one. It's not impossible. It would be a great thing to do, actually.
Thanks, Sue. And another question for you. We'll just roll them all to you now. And this is a question from Kiprono, wondering how government institutions like ACARA and state education bodies can be more involved and proactive in terms of providing ongoing financial resources to schools and community agencies that support students from refugee backgrounds, support beyond providing policy and guidelines.
Yeah, I think there's a whole other presentation that could be done around accountability measures in terms of how funding is allocated, which I don't want to go deeply into now because we don't have time. But I think there does need to be better accountability. I think there's been a lot of work happening in New South Wales around how money is being allocated to schools to attend to and support these particular groups of students, including refugees, but the actual ability for collecting information around, well, what's happening with that money is a conversation that's ongoing and needs to probably become, more targeted and there needs to be more accountability around how the money's being spent. So I hope that sort of helps.
Yeah. Thank you, Sue. And I'm glad that question came in, and I'm glad you've responded to it. Certainly, this has been something that Myan and others that we work with have been advocating for many years now. Exactly as you've said it, Sue, we need better accountability measures for how the money that comes through the National Education EAL agreement, how that money is spent in individual schools. And of course, there is a balance between autonomy or held by individual schools in terms of determining how they spend allocated funding, but also some broader accountability in terms of public funds being directed to students. And at the moment, as far as we understand, there is none. So it's certainly an area that we've been talking to government about, and it's a bit of an ongoing project. A question from Sophia from SSI in New South Wales to you, Hala. Can you talk a little bit about how you were able to support students technology-wise learning from home? I think that's a really important question. Everybody grappled with this.
Okay, so there are a couple of things that we did. We were able to put an order in for some devices and dongles to support some of the students from working from home, but in particular with students with special needs, we actually never closed. So we did have students come out to the school, a small number of students with special needs to come out to the school, and we worked with those students on site in terms of supporting them. In addition to that, as I said earlier, I think our non-teaching staff, so I'm talking about student learning support officers, in addition to the teachers, we're constantly in contact with families, in particular with those who classify as kids with special needs, to make sure that their needs, the learning needs, are being met. Now, did we actually get to everyone? The answer is no. Some people did become more disengaged with time, I guess, while not at school, but there were certain success stories with some kids. Now, we've also had a partner university also come in and assist with some devices. We had some devices at school that were on loan. And I guess the learning packs, so those kids, quite a lot of our parents actually opted for learning packs instead of having the kids work online, because it was just something that they're probably more comfortable themselves with, just from their own experiences, I guess, going through schooling.
Thank you, Hala. We have a lot of questions that we're just not going to get through, so I'm just sort of jumping around a bit. A question for you, Mel. Why do you think years 7 to 8 students are particularly at risk of further disadvantage? You'd mentioned Pacifica students. Is there something you want to add there?
Sure. Probably I should have been clearer that this wasn't. This was more an addition to the existing more common points of disengagement that might be in that more year 9, 10 kind of age group. So the comment from the Pacifica team is more about some of those drop-off points, the common drop-off points are becoming earlier, and that the remote learning period exacerbated, I think, again, for those students that were in that year 7 and 8 that might, in normal circumstances, have some of the characteristics of beginning to disengage, but they're within a school environment. There's more protective factors or more reasons they might continue to engage further down the track, that those weren't there in the remote learning environment. And so more of those students dropped off earlier. I hope that makes sense. So it's not that they're more highly disengaged than the later year levels where we see those trends, but more that they're in addition to or earlier signs of for those students at risk of disengagement.
Great, thanks, Mel. And I'm going to throw you another question from Simone Cassidy, and I think everyone can see the Q&A box that I'm working through. So Simone is saying she's been frustrated that for families where the school did not have a staff member with a particular language, schools in her experience didn't use telephone interpreters to contact families, even when students are completely disengaged from learning. Simone would like to hear from, actually perhaps from you, Mel, but also in particular Hala and Sue. Are schools in your states more willing or able to utilise telephone interpreters? If so, how have you got there? And for Victoria, what can we do to improve practice so that families are reached?
I could just start by saying maybe that in the long-running RESP program, so we've worked with over 130 schools in that intense 2-year program, the use of interpreters and confidence across the broad school staff with using interpreters is a consistently high, like one of the first cabs off the rank in terms of it's often not there even in schools that have a really, really diverse student population. If you're in Victoria, I would definitely flag that Foundation House runs professional learning for schools on this topic. And if you're a teacher in a school that has that kind of passion or interest or can see that gap, I would encourage you to advocate within your school to take advantage of that professional learning. But then there are other department funded resources available to supporting that, but just would validate that it's a very consistent theme for us in the work we do with schools across the board.
So Hala or Sue, would you like to respond?
I would say in Queensland that there is use of telephone interpreters. There's certainly a statement about it in policy information for schools. It probably depends to a certain extent on the culture of the school and the EAL-ness of the school, I would say.
We're in a position where we're actually quite lucky because we do have a diverse student body, but we also have a very diverse teacher body as well. So quite a lot of our teachers and non-teaching staff speak different languages. So we usually access them as a first point, and then with the languages that we have difficulty with, of course, we access telephone interpreters.
Terrific. Thanks, Hala. Julie, I'm going to throw to you. There's a couple of questions for you. The first one from Caprono. Are you able to expand a bit on one of the recommendations regarding number 5 under state and territory government, the COVID catch-up, June 2020, page 4? Any traction response on this, or is it still too early?
I have to confess, I'd need more context on what that actual recommendation was. I need to open up my report, so maybe we can move to another question, and I'll come back to it once I've actually got what recommendation 5 was.
If you could add a little bit more detail, we can come back to that question. The other question for you specifically, Julie, is from Sophia from SSI. Could you talk a little bit more about the growth in learning for L-BOAT versus non-L-BOAT students as presented in your first slide?
Yeah, sure. And look, I should also want to address some comments coming through from Helen there about the deficiencies in the L-BOAT data, which I believe Sue has spoken to potentially before I joined. The point of me showing those slides initially is by no means trying to say that that group is the same as the group that that is likely to be the refugee group that we're talking about here, who obviously need a lot more support. Simply the reason, partly we've just done a very quick, we've not published that data. That was literally just internal data that's using the existing categories that are there. So it's really just picking out what's there and seeing what it says and then trying to make sense of it. So I really appreciate that feedback on some of the deficiencies in it. And for this reason, we haven't actually explicitly written on this whole area yet, but it's something that we are interested in learning more about. Really, I suspect that obviously of, the refugees who will have language needs will also often be experiencing some form of disadvantage, financial disadvantage in the home. That's really all that was trying to say, was it's a subset of that broader group. So in terms of just those slides, so the way that we looked at growth there is we've actually gotten data that matched students between the year levels, so years 7 to 9. So it was quite a sophisticated piece of work that took like 18 months to do internally. And you actually don't see a lot of the growth metrics presented in that way. There is sort of growth metrics on the My Schools website, for example, or in the sort of national report that's done by ACARA. But ours used a somewhat more granular method to make an attempt to better match and identify the growth of specific students. So I'm not sure if that's the type of context that you're after, but I think it really jumped out at us, the findings around LBOAT as just that category in the data set, because the differences that were arising between LBOAT and non-LBOAT were, and obviously because there is a wealthy kind of migrant group within that, were so much more than the differences between other groups that we often talk about. And I think that what is interesting about that is that there is just culturally that is telling us something, I think, as a nation as well. So yeah, I think it's interesting learning. Make of it what you will. I'd be very interested to hear others' opinions.
Yeah.
Sue, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, Julie, I think I'll send you some of my work. I just don't think there's anything we can trust about the LBOAT category because it's so broad, and I'm really happy to share with you some of the research I've done with that category to give you an insight into that. But I agree, the high performing group I think are really interesting, and there's a lot to be said for bilingualism. A lot to be said for, looking at the groups who obviously are proficiently bilingual, particularly, with English as one of those languages, and they're doing really outstandingly on those tests. So, but that's, they're the group that they're doing great, and we want to make sure everybody's doing great, don't we? So, yeah, I'll send you through some stuff.
Great, thanks.
And can I just ask a follow-on question to that? Because I think, clearly we're in agreement that there's some, sort of overall assumptions or conclusions from the data, but a lot of gaps. We just can't get to the diversity of that cohort. And if this is too complex a question, it's for further discussion. But what ought we do about that as service providers and advocates in this space, wanting to influence policy and program for better outcomes for those students who need it most in this refugee migrant backgrounds category? Who should we be talking to? Who is looking at the NAPLAN data? Is the NAPLAN data used to inform education policy and programming at the Commonwealth level and or at the state and territory level? So I guess my question is, how important is it really to try and influence better data collection in that area, or ought we direct our efforts in other areas? Perhaps it's all of that.
Nadine, can I just mention something in regards to that? I mean, having all that data is all great and it's very informative, but we really need to have a big focus on teacher education. What we find that in schools, we do quite a lot of remedial work to fill gaps and get those kids to where they need to get to. But if we're going to look at longer lasting impact, of course, or if you want, or bigger impact, we really need to put some resources into teacher education way before they come into schools. It really needs to start at the university level, if you want, and it needs to continue while it's at schools. And we are, I guess, experts in our own context, and we sort of know what our teachers need and what our kids need, and we tailor that support based on those needs. But we really need to also look at what is being put on schools in terms of deadlines and requirements, and it's a huge workload. I mean, what we're currently dealing with in term 4 as a school, in addition to the flow-on effect of COVID, is significant. So we really need to take a step back and perhaps go to basics a little bit and invest in teacher education and let schools do what they need to do, rather than have all of those additional stuff mandated on them to cover the gaps, I guess, that exist in society.
Any other responses from the other panelists? Because then I was going to respond to you, Hala. And thanks a lot for jumping in, because I've been conscious as we've been talking about this bigger picture data, what that actually means for schools like yours on the ground, and yourself as a principal of a school with a very diverse student population. So you know and understand very intimately the diversity of that population group and what you need to do as a school to invest in and ensure better education outcomes for them. So thank you. That's really important. Sue or
yeah, I'm happy to step in. I agree, Hala, thank you. I think we have got a looming problem with teacher education, and I think one place to perhaps be advocating is in the AITSL standards. Now, teacher education is absolutely mapped onto AITSL standards. We have to comply with those and make sure that everyone who's coming through gets those. There isn't one that specifically focuses on language. There is certainly one that focuses on cultural diversity, but there isn't one that focuses on language. So I think that would be a good place for there to be something happening that would immediately, improve things at the teacher education level. I think we also do have pushback against, and the reason I sort of started my presentation was talking about the difference between language and literacy, is when we have a category like LVOTE that shows everyone's doing really well, who have a language background, it immediately means that if we look at that data, we think, okay, language isn't a problem. So we have literacy responses, mainstream literacy responses to NAPLAN, but they don't necessarily equate to good responses for language learners. Certainly literacy is part of it, but we must have that informed understanding of how language plays into literacy. So I think we just have to keep speaking back to that poor category and see if we can change. And I think at the state levels first and foremost, because the states are the holders of education in the country, even though we have the federal body. We need to be working certainly at the state level and then ideally, of course, at the federal as well.
Julie, did you want to add anything? I see you've taken yourself off mute.
Oh, yeah. I think I'd second Susan and Hala's comments. And I think, Nadine, you also asked about, are there any, who are the research bodies looking in this space?
Where do we direct our advocacy efforts?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Look, and I'd be interested to know the answer to that question in terms of who are the bodies that are really leading and taking this forward. Yeah. I know that the Scanlon Foundation did a little bit of work in this space, but look, Grattan, this isn't an issue that Grattan has taken on, but we'd be interested in writing more on it. And I think one of Grattan's strengths is that we do have a good public profile, and we do like to get into messy data. So if there's a way that we can cut the NAPLAN data and it's meaningful, but we should keep talking.
Thank you, Julie.
Nadine, sorry, can I just say also ACTA, the Australian Council of TESOL Associations, does a lot of advocacy in this space. So they've got a great website, they've got a lot of good information there. So that's somewhere to go as well to get some good stuff.
Yeah, great, Sue. And Helen Moore, who's joined us today, has posted a few things in the chat box and asked a couple of questions pointing to that too. And I will just go to Helen's question about what is Myan doing in this area. So Helen did ask a question: what is Myan doing to engage with mainstream policy bodies, for example, ACARA and others? For Myan as a national body, we would direct our advocacy to the Commonwealth Government. So as some of our panellists have highlighted, you've got a mix here with responsibilities with the state government and, with the Commonwealth, and also with the governments at the state and territory level, often where, more specific decisions are made and resources directed, except around EAL. So certainly, as part of the response to that, Helen, we're certainly providing information to the sector to engage in your own advocacy at the state level. And we're also thinking about where we best direct our advocacy, if it's through the National Education Roundtable at the Commonwealth level. So it's a good point, Helen. And as Julie said and others today, I think there's certainly some considerations for the National Education Roundtable about how we progress our advocacy on a range of issues, including the NAPLAN data or much better data collection. I'm going to jump to another question for you, Mel, because I think someone else had asked this question around particular cultural backgrounds. So a question from Tebeher: can you please reflect on differences in student disengagement by cultural backgrounds, countries of origin? Anything to share there? And other panellists might comment on this as well, including yourself, Hala.
My first thought in answer to that question is no, I don't think I can comment meaningfully on that, because I'm not sure it's a helpful way to compare and talk about engagement. From a CMY perspective, some of our programs that engage directly with young people are engaging with cultural backgrounds or countries of origin that are often stereotyped as highly disengaged or motivated in education, but actually they're engaging with inspiring, motivated leaders and highly engaged students. So I think it's much more about other factors to do with more direct work done with family, with the culture of the school, and the way that more broadly, like listening to Hala is so inspiring, thinking if every school had that kind of approach, we wouldn't be talking about categorising by cultural backgrounds. We would be talking about every student and their story and their family and their context. So I would much prefer schools come with that lens than to categorise groups. So it's probably not helpful, but.
Thank you, Mel. Hala?
I actually agree. The complexities that we're facing, I think my school at least, were very consistent across the cultural background. So it wasn't a particular cultural background that struggled more than others. What made a difference, I guess, is the level of education in the family, if you want, and how much families were able to assist the students with their work. But if we look at cultural backgrounds, I don't think at my school there was a particular difference across the 36 nationalities that we have with the languages that we speak.
Thanks, Hala. We've come to the end of our session today. There's a number of other questions that we just didn't get to. We had quite a full Q&A box with some very specific questions around data, which was great, and a range of others. It says to me that it's important for us and the Education Roundtable to consider how we follow up on this national event today. Certainly the Roundtable had considered hosting this kind of event a few months ago, but it was quite a juggle with the sort of evolving and unprecedented implications of COVID-19 to host something a few months ago when certainly Victoria was moving into hard lockdown again. But certainly I think once again the value of bringing together an expert panel and sharing your views with the sector and having the sector, and I mean that very broadly, government, the NGO sector, settlement, education, health, everyone in between, coming together to explore these issues is really critical. And there's a lot of food for thought for the National Education Roundtable. So we will certainly consider how we might respond to this and host something similar in 2021. And I'm also really mindful that, as I mentioned before, education is one of the top 3 or 4 priorities that we hear from young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds always. And I mean, for the last 10, 15, 20 years, for those of us who've been around for a while, it's not new. Education, employment, mental health, and racism and discrimination are consistently the top 4 issues for young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds, and I suspect their families and communities. So it certainly remains a priority area for Myan and for all of us. There is a lot of work to do in all areas, but also some really excellent good practice on the ground and in research that we need to be understanding better and understanding how we replicate. And as you said, Mel, also I think COVID-19 has also presented us an opportunity to reflect on all of that and reflect on how we do this better so that young people get the support that they need to thrive, with education being a key tool for that. So thank you very much once again to all of those who've joined us and to our terrific expert panel. We really look forward to engaging with all of you as we all work on progressing these issues. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.